My name is Samantha Sangle. I'm an Associate Programs Manager for the Clark Cox Family Foundation. And today I will present to you our findings on the system of mass incarceration. Just to kind of provide some context before we get started, mass incarceration really refers to a lot of different components that make up this entire system. We recognize that each one of these systems have very different cultures, different incentives, and different motives. So when we talk about and understand the system, know that we're not talking about one specific portion of the system, for example, the police, which are a very public-facing portion, but rather it is the culmination of all the different actors that make up the system that now exists. So before we get into the presentation, I want to talk briefly about historical context. Mass incarceration did not happen overnight, but is really the result of decades of policy decisions at all levels of government that have gotten us to be the world's largest incarcerator. So for today's presentation, I'm going to focus really on where we are now, point in time, but to give you some background and historical overview, I would encourage you all to watch the documentary 13th. So for those of you who haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so. For brevity today, I'm going to show you the trailer from that movie that provides, again, some of that historical background and context, just to give you some framework for the discussion today.
1 out of 4 human beings with their hands on bars, shackled, in the world are locked up here in the land of the free.
Kalief Browder was walking home from a party when he was stopped by police.
Then they said, we're gonna take you to the precinct and most likely we're gonna let you go home, and then I never went home.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. There are exceptions, including criminals.
The loophole was immediately exploited. What you got after that was a rapid transition to a mythology of black criminality.
Some people got the real problem.
Animals, beasts that needed to be controlled.
You better believe it.
I'm only human.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators.
Millions of dollars will be allocated for prison and jail facilities.
3 strikes and you are out.
It was an enormous burden on the black community, but it also violated a sense of core fairness.
Some people got the real problem.
States were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime.
It's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration because it has become heavily monetized.
I'm only human.
The focus is on taking people from prison, putting them in community corrections, parole and probation.
How much progress is it really if now there's a private company making money off the GPS monitor?
We now have more African Americans under criminal supervision than all the slaves back in the 1850s.
I'm only human.
We are the products of the history that our ancestors chose. Products of that set of choices that we have to understand in order to escape from it.
We should go looking somewhere high. I'm only human. After all, don't put the blame on me.
So what are the goals of this project? What is the Clark Cox Family Foundation trying to do to change this issue? The first thing we set out to do was visually represent the different components that make up the system of mass incarceration, the self-perpetuating ecosystem, as we call it. Mass incarceration, to give you a very concise definition, it refers to the very distinctly American phenomena of historically and comparatively extreme rates of incarceration. Historically refers to, as opposed to other times in America's own history, and comparatively refers to our system versus other countries in the world. Once we began understanding this system after multiple years of research and really intense collaboration with community partners and experts in this arena, we began to get out into the community to share our findings. Because what we found, the deeper we dug, was that there was really an interconnectedness to everything that was going on. So with some initial research and consultation completed, we got out into the community, and today we've shared our findings with over 1,500 people. We're really talking to anyone and everyone because this system really impacts all corners of our society. We are particularly interested in talking to those who work directly with youth because we recognize that once someone gets involved in the criminal justice system, the barriers for re-entry successfully into the community are incredibly profound. And so from our preventative standpoint, we're really trying to reach those who work directly with youth to try and help them engage with youth in a different way to prevent entry into the system to start with. We really believe that informing public and community leadership is a critical step towards forming coalition and building momentum around reform. Let's start by taking a look at the numbers. So previously I mentioned that this is a very distinctly American phenomena of extreme rates of incarceration. But what does extreme mean? How many people are we really talking about? So the first chart I'll show you shows the state and federal prison population over time, starting in the 80s up until close to present day. And there's a few things I'd like to point out when we look at this data. First, from the 80s until now, you can see that the state and federal prison populations have gone up exponentially over time. So by the time we got to 2015, we were talking about 1.5 or 1.6 million people who were incarcerated. The second thing that I will point out when we look at this graph is that the gray line in the middle of the chart are those who are in state custody, whereas the much smaller green line along the bottom represent those in federal custody. So when we talk about this system, the vast majority of people are incarcerated in state-level facilities. Think about reform efforts. When we think about where we can leverage change, this is really a state's issue, and there are a lot of things that we need to do here in Missouri. The third piece of context that I would add that's not visually represented here, but is a question that we often get, relates to private prisons. So because private prisons are kind of a buzzword, frequently in the news, we wanted to clarify that only about 10% of prisoners in the country are housed in completely privately operated facilities. By and large, most facilities are run by the state or federal government. Private facilities are largely used for immigration detention purposes. So while we know that this is an important part of the system and something we need to be aware of, really the vast majority of people are held in federally and state-run facilities. So even that 1.5, 1.6 million people that I mentioned that were in state and federal custody as of 2015, that number is just a tiny fraction of those who are under the correctional control. When you take into consideration people who are in local and county jails, you're talking about a total confined population of approximately 2.3 million people. And even that is just a small part of this total pie. When we take people who are under direct community supervision, direct supervision by the state, albeit in the community via probation and parole, we're talking about a total correctional population of about 7 million people. And really, that 7 million just represent those who are directly involved in the system. We know that oftentimes people have children, they have significant others, they have family members who are deeply impacted by their absence and their involvement in this system. So each and every year, the criminal justice system impacts millions upon millions of Americans. And these numbers make the United States stand out in the global community. Here we see the United States incarceration rate controlled per population versus other democracies around the world. And just by eyeballing it, you can see that the United States incarcerates almost 3 times as many people as the second closest country on this list. And I would add to that if we were to put in countries, I mentioned that these were democratic countries, but if we were to add countries that are not considered to be democracies, like Russia or China, this graph actually wouldn't change. As a fraction of our population, the United States incarcerates more people than any country in the entire world. And one thing I would add here, when we start to think about why, how did we get here, you'll notice that all countries have a criminal justice system, and we are certainly not advocating that there be no law enforcement, that there be no criminal justice system whatsoever. But when we think about culture and we think about what drives our incarceration rate up so high, it really has to do with our societal stance on what we do with those who break the rules. Here in the United States, we really embrace a tough on crime ideology that manifests itself in much higher rates of incarceration. What you see in other countries are things like restorative justice and actual rehabilitation for those who go into the criminal justice system. But with a strictly punishment-oriented, punitive system like we have here, our numbers skyrocket as a result. And it's really, really expensive to incarcerate and confine and supervise so many people. Here we see state spending on corrections over time, starting in the mid-'80s up until close to present day. And again, as with the chart before, you can see exponential growth over time. But by the time we get to 2015, the states were spending nearly $57 billion on corrections. That is billion with a B. And if you add in what the federal government is spending on corrections, that number jumps to approximately $80 billion each and every year. So each year, annually, in the United States, we are injecting $80 billion into the system just to keep it running. That is $80 billion that is not going for mental health services, that is not going for education or sustainable housing or health care. $80 billion each and every year to maintain this level of correction in the United States. And there are a lot of people who have a very vested interest in us continuing to invest that much money into the system. So as I mentioned before, most people who are incarcerated are held in state and federally operated facilities. But within publicly held facilities, there are a lot of privatized services. So what you see before you is just a partial list of private companies that currently provide services within the correction system that are making a tremendous amount of profit. So these are things like commissary services, medical services, the food services, all of the things that people need to survive in institutions are being provided by for-profit companies who make a lot of money as a result. So as taxpayers and as consumers, it's fair to ask, what are we getting for such a tremendous investment into the criminal justice system? For $80 billion, what kind of results are we seeing? So one could certainly make the argument that if we as a society are safer as a result of this investment, then maybe it's worth it. But when we look at the crime rate versus the incarceration rate, that's simply not the story that the data tells us. So here we see incarceration rates starting in the late 70s up until close to present day versus property and violent crime rates during that same time period. And there are a couple things I'd like to point out when we look at this data. First, up until 2000, there are various points in time where incarceration was climbing and so were crime rates. So incarceration was going up, crime was also going up. And after 2000, when incarceration rates started to somewhat stabilize, we see that crime rates only marginally decreased. So what that indicates is it's a very complicated relationship. It's certainly not a direct correlation. What this suggests, and what other industry experts suggest, is that there are other factors that are much more powerful at driving the crime rate than how many people we can find, namely the economy. When the economy prospers and thrives, crime rates go down. And so you can see this investment over time has yielded very mixed results. Another metric of success that we can consider as taxpayers, as community members, is our recidivism rates. So how effective are we at deterring people from future crime based on involvement in the criminal justice system? And here we see an even bleaker picture than what we saw before. Sometimes when we interact with people who kind of embrace a tough on crime policy mindset, there's this idea that, you know, we're just going to put people away in prison and throw away the key. I mean, whatever, just get them off the streets, it's fine. But really, that's not how it works in this country. 95% of people who go into state facilities eventually come home. Most of the time they come back to the communities that they came from originally. And while they were incarcerated, very often people have almost no access to educational advancement opportunities, job skill training, substance abuse treatment, or mental health treatment. And so they are removed from their families, they are removed from the community, receive very little support while they are inside the system. And when they return, they face what are called collateral consequences. So nationally, there are almost 50,000 types of consequences that someone can face for having a conviction on their record. Here in Missouri, it's almost 1,000. So people come back to the communities that they came from without having had any training or support. And they now face barriers on where they can live, what kind of work they can do, what kind of support they can receive, what kind of licensure they can obtain. And so it should surprise no one that nationally, within 3 years of release, nearly 68% of people are rearrested. And within 5 years, that number climbs to 77%. So again, when we ask ourselves, is the investment in this system yielding positive results for public safety and for our community? The answer is a resounding no. This system is not a burden that is borne equally in every community in our society. So let's take a look here at incarceration rates for young males aged 20 to 39. These are broken into racial cohorts and educational cohorts. So you see here, for young white males, the 3 educational breakdowns are for people who went to college. In the middle are people who completed high school but did not go to college. And the third column are those who dropped out of high school. And then you see the same educational cohorts for the same age young African American males. There's a couple things that we learn when we look at this data. So we're looking at 2 points in time, in 1972 and then again in 2010. The 3 things that I'd like you to take away from this. 1, whether you consider the 70s or now, it has always been true that if you have less formal education, if you drop out of high school, you are much more likely to be incarcerated in your lifetime than the males in your racial cohort who complete high school and go into college. The second thing is whether you look at the 70s or now, it has always been true that young African American males are significantly more likely to be incarcerated over the course of their lifetime than white males when you control for education. When you combine those two, the intersectionality of those 2 risk groups, young African American males who've dropped out of high school, I draw your attention to the very tallest chart, the very tallest bar on that chart, which reads 35%. So the way that we read that data, in 2010, 35%, or slightly more than 1 in 3 young African American males was incarcerated. And that data holds true today. Incarceration doesn't just hurt people who they themselves go into the system. To put it very bluntly, incarceration hurts children and families as well. For families who have interaction with the criminal justice system, most of the time the person that they lose to that system is a young working age adult. So that's an entire income source. So for many of these families, they were already struggling to make ends meet, and they are now faced with poverty or more deep impoverishment as a result of incarceration. We also know that research has been unequivocally clear the detrimental impact that poverty can have on a child's educational and life attainment. But it's even more complicated than that. Children who experience parental incarceration are more likely to have a lower GPA, and are they themselves more likely to drop out of high school. So when you think about what we just discussed, if your parent is incarcerated and you drop out of high school, you yourself are much more likely to become incarcerated during your lifetime. So you see how we very quickly get into a multi-generational impact that this system has on families. And this is a reality for more than 5 million children in this country who now have or recently have had a parent incarcerated, typically before the child reaches the age of 10, which is a critical developmental time. In addition to these things, experiencing parental incarceration leaves children at a much higher risk for a variety of mental and physical health challenges. So just a few of the things you see listed here. For children with incarcerated fathers, they are statistically more likely to suffer from PTSD, anxiety, things like asthma and migraines. And of course, we know children who experience parental incarceration are more likely to become involved in the foster care system and have a range of other physical and mental health challenges as a result. They are at much higher risk of experiencing these things. So now I'd like to take a look at our ecosystem map, which is the visual depiction that I mentioned earlier. This is the result of over 2 years of research and collaboration within the St. Louis community and within the criminal justice field. This system depicts all of the different components that make up mass incarceration and visually represents how it is a self-perpetuating, self-sustaining system. I would encourage you to go to our website where this is interactive. It's very pretty to look at on its own, very colorful, but really it's meant to be used as an interactive tool. So if you go to our website, all of the arrows, you can hover over them for more thorough descriptions, and if you click on them, you're actually given the data that substantiates why it's on the map. So For the sake of time, I will show you one of our feedback loops just to give you an idea of how the map works, and then again would strongly encourage you to follow up and interact with this online. So we'll take a look at distressed communities, which is the orange section in the upper left-hand side of your map. We'll start by talking about community resources. What do I mean when I say community resources? This refers to things like safe parks, public libraries, well-funded schools. So what happens in a community when you have ample community resources? So what's at the bottom of an arrow will either lead to an increase or decrease in what's at the top. And you'll see a plus or a minus sign to denote how that relationship works. So the way that you would read this is, an increase in community resources leads to an increase in early childhood enrichment, which leads to an increase in interpersonal skills. And also, having more community resources leads to more educational and vocational training opportunities. So essentially, you have a community that has ample resources where children are allowed to be successful, where they have a lot of enrichment opportunities that allow them to grow the skills that they need to go on and achieve success later in life. So these things all culminate in more jobs and employment being available in the community, as well as making children and family poised to get those jobs and to keep those jobs. And what is the one thing that we know about gainful employment? For a community that has more job opportunities available, where people are able to work and sustain themselves, that community is likely to experience less incarceration as a result. Because when people have a job that they are able to live off of, they're less likely to commit crime. So the community that you see before you is very well resourced with all the types of things that kids need to be successful, to go on, to have jobs, and to stay out of the criminal justice system. So what happens when you introduce one other element into the system? Poverty. When a community is impacted by poverty, there are less likely to be early childhood enrichment opportunities and more likely to be fewer jobs and less likely to have ample jobs and employment available. And as we know, when jobs and employment go down, incarceration rate goes up. So we see things, the arrows start to reverse in nature. So as incarceration rate goes up, jobs and employment then go down because people who are returning from the criminal justice system face a tremendous amount of barriers in getting employment. And then again, as jobs and employment go down, poverty goes up. So you see how we get into a very self-feeding, self-perpetuating feedback loop in communities impacted by poverty and impacted by incarceration. But I have very good news for you. So this is a system that can and will be changed. And to look for evidence of change, to consider just one example, a leader in this space, we will go to a very unlikely source, the Lone Star State of Texas. Texas had seen steady increases in their incarceration rates over time, very similar to national trends. So here we see that in the late 70s, things started to pick up for incarceration in Texas, and by the early 90s, numbers were jumping. And so Texas after 2000, you can see that things started to change for Texas. So we can ask ourselves, what happened there? What did they do differently to see their incarceration rates start to go down? Much like Missouri, Texas was poised to have to build a new facility because their incarceration rate had climbed so high, they weren't able to house all of the inmates that they needed to. So from a fiscal conservative perspective, Texas was like, we have to stop building new facilities. We have to start doing something proactively to prevent people from returning in and out of the system. So Texas's very proactive stance involved providing substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment for people who were incarcerated, as well as those who were transitioning back into the community. Because often they found incarceration was a result of untreated and undiagnosed mental health and substance abuse issues. In addition to those things, Texas began providing more transitional supports like halfway houses and more intermediate sanctions so that people weren't sent immediately back to prison for one violation. Finally, in the initial set of reforms, Texas set caseload limits for probation officers, which allowed a lot more accountability and support for people as they were returning into the community. So what happened in Texas? Not only did Texas not have to build a new facility, but in the last 6 years, they've been able to close 8 of them. 8 facilities that are no longer in operation in the state of Texas. Each year that those 8 prisons are not operating, the state is saving millions and millions of dollars. In 2015, despite the fact that they've closed facilities and that they've released more than 10,000 additional people back into the community, Texas saw its overall crime rate drop to the lowest it had been since 1968. So Texas was able to decarcerate with no negative impact on public safety. Texas is not the only state to make changes in this space. Here we see approximately a dozen states who have very successfully implemented reforms to see at least 10% declines in their incarceration rate over about a 10-year period. On this list, you see states that are red, deep red states, deep blue states, very purple states, everything in between. This does not have to be a partisan issue. There's widespread political support across the spectrum for making changes and reforms in this space. So a state that you do not see on the list would be Missouri. In the same time period, Missouri's gone the opposite direction and seen an increase by 3% of our incarceration rate. This places us in the bottom quartile of all states in the country. We are actually also leading the nation for the highest rate of incarceration of women of any state in the country. So Missouri clearly has its work cut out for it. But there are a lot of people doing really great work to reform this issue and to support those impacted. Here you see our St. Louis Regional Criminal Justice Resource Ecosystem Map, which shows approximately 200 nonprofits in the St. Louis region who provide direct services to children and families who are impacted, as well as who work in advocacy, policy, research, all kinds of the areas around criminal justice reform. Again, it's very colorful and very pretty to look at when you look at it in a static way, but it is interactive on our website, which makes it a great tool for case managers or for anyone who works directly or knows families who could benefit from services. What you would do is go and click on one of the big colored circles, which will isolate everything around it, and you can then see with more detail what are the nonprofits, what are the services. You can hover over a nonprofit and see a description, and if you click on the words, you'll actually be taken straight to that resource. So it's a very concise way to take a lot of information and have it immediately at your fingertips. So in conclusion, we know that the ecosystem will not get better on its own. It has shown time and time again over the past several decades to be a very self-perpetuating, very hard to reform system. We believe that knowledge, by being here today, by learning more, is the first step towards creating a more just system. We also have a handout in your brochures that details next steps for things you can do to learn even more or to get more deeply involved in the community if you feel so inclined. We believe that the solution lies in our investment priorities. As we face a workforce development crisis in this country because birth cohorts are smaller and we have a rapidly aging baby boomer population, it becomes critical for our society to look at how we are raising and training our young workforce of tomorrow. So it is an absolute imperative for the economic well-being of the St. Louis region and for our country to really start investing in youth and support services for families, as opposed to continuing such a steep investment in the system of mass incarceration. I thank you again so much for your time today. If you're interested in learning more or would like to schedule a presentation for your community group, please visit our website at www.clarkfoxstl.com. As the program manager for this initiative, you can reach me at samantha@clark-fox.com. Thank you again.